So, possible answers to the question: yes, no, who cares, does it really matter, and as long as they stay away from us. If you're interested in more science fiction approaches, and what if they're here already, we don't yet know about them, but they've come from elsewhere, and what if they've been and gone? So if you like just a 2-minute address, I don't think I get away with this really. The answer, I could just say, go to your pharmacist and they'll give you the quick answer. Do you have any suggestions what the question to the pharmacist might be, or what their answer might be? Doesn't matter, you'll find out later on. So there's a quick answer, and we'll come back to it later. Perhaps a more fundamental question in light of our introductory reading: what's the connection of our question in the title with the Bible and God's purpose? So let's try and just give a slight introduction to this area. So my first few slides are really context setting before we take this context and then take a wider view, as it were, from here outside this planet. Psalm 115: even the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth hath he given to the children of men. That does seem to me to imply some kind of separation. Call it separation of powers. There's God's power, as Psalm 8 has already said in our reading. The heavens declare the glory of God, so it's a manifestation of God's power. So in this verse here in Psalm 115, separation between God's power and man's power, the implication being it's not for man to dictate to God. There's a relationship between the heavens and the earth. And like Job, how we view the universe can make a big difference. So, like the psalmist, we look up and observe the heavens. There's some pictures of what we might see, and I'm sure most of us are full of marvel and wonder at what we see. And we know that in the Old Testament, for example in the book of Job, the Hebrews and their contemporaries, the Babylonians, made great strides in their observations of the heavens, so they recorded them, and they could make predictions of various kinds. And there's references to constellations in the book of Job, such as Arcturus, Orion, Pleiades and the Chambers of the South, and we've no reason to think they're vastly different from the way we understand them today. Nevertheless, we are reminded that God dwells in light unapproachable, whom no man hath seen nor can see. So, relationship between those two things, God the Creator, all-powerful, and ourselves on earth. Psalm 19 takes Psalm 8 a little bit further. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So there is communication going on here between the creation that God has made and ourselves as observers. So that's what we're going to explore for a moment or two now. So just a few pictures of what we might see in the heavens. And of course, if you've got a telescope and you look at varying magnifications, you tend to see more or less of the same thing. And you go closer, you can see brightly burning stars such as the ones here, and also great galaxies, many of which are significant distances from the Earth, but we now have powerful telescopes that can see these, and that's just different views, different wavelengths of distant bodies such as infrared, the visible light which you can see, and X-ray of the kind you could use in hospitals. And to spiral galaxy pair, astronomers use the Hubble telescope to take a portrait of a stunning pair of galaxies such as seen here. And another one here, Kepler, the first rocket exoplanet to be found within the habitable zone, the region around the host star where the temperature is right for liquid water. So obviously, if people are looking for areas where there might be similarities to life on Earth, they're looking for similar conditions that we enjoy on this planet. Something where it gets a little bit hotter, a giant planet which is about half the mass of Jupiter and orbits its star every 4 days. So coming back to my earlier point, this relationship between heaven and earth between God and ourselves. What is the responsibility of ourselves? Genesis tells us, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. So there is a relationship there, you see, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky. So a commission has been given to men and women to take a supervisory role with regard to the creation that God has made. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, of course, we know it's not that simple. There are many aspects of the physical creation which could claim to be superior to us in terms of size, speed, momentum, but the one thing that distinguishes us from the rest of creation is our intellectual capacity to be able to reason about God's creation. So the elephants don't push us around, though that would be quite easy to do. Because of our mental superiority, we're able to exercise this kind of sovereignty described in these verses here. So, is there other life on earth? Was there other life on earth? And does this give us any clues as to what might be elsewhere in the solar system and the universe? Now, this is just one of those topics that's a little bit incidental to my main theme this afternoon, but I've included it because I think it's of interest. And one thing that comes to mind is the dinosaurs. Here's a couple of examples with the skeletons more or less complete. And here's some dinosaur backbones being found in the Himalayas. And you may wonder, well, how have they got into the Himalayas? And the answer is, by and large, through continents coming together, Earth slowly moves, these great tectonic plates moving together and forcing the mountains up between them. So anything that's buried in the continents tends to, over time, surface on the mountainside. And just to give you a picture of the main Earth's tectonic plates, the boundaries between these tectonic plates are shown here in black. And there's various kinds of movement. There's the movement that produces new kinds of hills and mountains, where there's a kind of pressure point between them, and there's another one, such as the one in California, where the plates are running in parallel. So they stick together most of the time, but just occasionally there's something that triggers some disruption and they'll jerk apart like that. And the extent to which they jerk apart will indicate the severity of the earthquake that will happen. So I've been in most of these earthquake zones in the USA and in Japan, and can testify, if you stay in a hotel that's on the black line, then be prepared for a possible earthquake. Or if you're choosing a holiday and you want to have a rest-free vacation, it's probably wise not to choose a holiday on the black line, because you may be unfortunate enough to do so at such a time when there's a dislocation in the Earth's surface. Another interesting thing to notice here is that this boundary running through Israel here and Jerusalem is something that appears in prophecies about the latter days associated with God's purpose. So I'm not going to detail that this afternoon, but that's something that might be of interest to hear about for you in the future. So coming back to this relationship between heaven and earth, we have noted that in Psalm 8, I'll just read the underlined bits here. How excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? So a very important point to note at this point in time, which is obvious, when we look at the magnificence and glory and beauty of the heavens, and the apparent limitless nature and scope of what we see there, and compare it to our own finite, very small human frame, surely it makes us realize how insignificant in the cosmic scale of things we really are. So we have very big ideas, don't we? In our own sphere of influence, in our work, in our family, or if you're a member of Parliament, you can have very big ideas about what you want to do, but just on a physical level, in the grand scale of things, it's completely insignificant, isn't it? So perhaps a little bit more humility and preparedness to reverence God and his power in creation might be more appropriate today than it's ever been. And then in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. There seem to be two parts to Psalm 19. The first part, which is very similar to Psalm 8, but then the second part, beginning at verse 7, is a kind of spiritual analogue to what we've seen in the physical creation in the first part of Psalm 19. And this spiritual parallel is as follows: the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. So that's a useful counterbalance to this feeling of insignificance, which could leave us feeling with an insurmountable consciousness of despair. Well, if I'm so small and insignificant, what hope is there for me? There is every hope, because God has granted us his revelation in his word in order that it might teach us and tutor us in his ways and in his thoughts. And that's the purpose of this second part of Psalm 19. Therefore, there are two parts to God's creation: the natural, the physical, and the spiritual. And the first is related to the second. So I've just tried to summarize it in this slide here. Lessons for us. The wonder of the heavens communicates the glory of God, and it does not matter which language you happen to speak, because whatever that language is, it communicates to you and to me the points that we've already made. So nature speaks in a language all can understand and appreciate. And similarly, this parallel point, the laws of God are worthy of our reverence and respect, and the created order of things has a parallel in the spiritual order. And in general, expositors have called this God's two great books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And when I say book of scripture, I don't just mean the Psalms and Job, although that's what I refer to so far because it's particularly pertinent. But the New Testament also has this, it brings together this connection between the physical world, of which you and I are an integral part, and the spiritual world, which is God's purpose with ourselves and the earth on which we live. For example, Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, God, who caused the light to shine out of darkness, that's Genesis 1, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So the natural creation, the creation of light, is linked directly to God's spiritual light in his revelation in the Lord Jesus Christ. A very clear example there of this correspondence in the New Testament between God's two great books, the book of nature and the book of scripture. And we have a responsibility to consider both and act and behave appropriately. So firstly, we need to care for God's natural creation and not exploiting it for our own purposes or selfish ends, and we know there are substantial national and international concerns on that front just at the moment. And also caring for God's spiritual creation and not exploiting it for our own purposes or selfish ends. So those are two very severe sort of requests that God has placed upon us by this parallelism between these two things. But the question arises, where does the earth end and the heavens begin? And there have been different views about this over history, where the early views with the earth here, the firmament with where the stars are embedded there, and then the ocean above that to provide the rainwater. And of course the question arises, how is it all supported? And there have been various views about that. And then at the time of the Renaissance, the development of scientific inquiry, Sir Isaac Newton observed the apple falling from the tree and deduced his famous laws of gravity, and he observed that the laws which operate on earth are the same laws which operate in the heavens, the sky above the earth, the solar system and the stars. And humanly speaking, we would never have expected this, because the medieval view of the earth and the heavens was as previously described. So we need to be prepared for the unexpected when we start looking outside the earth as a system. And this is the difference. For example, the apple falls to earth at about 16 feet in 1 second, but on the moon it's about 1/6 of that on earth, so it would go more slowly. And we know that from experimental observation by the people who landed on the moon. So the moon, being smaller, a smaller planet than the earth, has got less gravitational attraction on the bodies that fall to its surface. But we know from history this was not accepted initially. It was perhaps a bit difficult. Sir Isaac Newton was accused of dethroning the providence of God. That is, the heavenly realm belonged to God. It is therefore not for man to try and analyse it, let alone try and visit it. Also, the earth was not round, it was flat, because the Bible refers to the four corners of the earth. But with the benefit of hindsight, it's generally accepted now. Bible passages about four corners may not be intended to be taken literally. It could be a way of expressing the complete earth. And there was a view at the time that man would never land on the moon because it would be interfering in God's domain. But it does tend to obscure one important point, which is often forgotten, is how inhospitable the moon is. It's a dead planet. And this shows you a picture of planet Earth when viewed from the surface of the moon. That's here. Of course, astronauts who landed on the moon took a variety of these kind of pictures. But the important thing about this is not so much the geology or the rocks that they're able to bring back with them. The really interesting thing that came out of this was a new and different kind of perspective with which to view the earth. It enabled many people to see the earth in a new way. Here's one example. If I'd been born in space, I would desire to visit the beautiful earth more than to visit space. It's a wonderful planet. We looked back and saw Earth, such a beautiful place, in contrast to the blackness of space and the deadness of the moon. This is our home, and we can't wait to return. I don't know if you've been on holiday to one of your favourite, most distant destinations from your hometown, and you get there and it's very exciting for the first 2 days, but after you've been there a few weeks, the novelty of it begins to pale, and in your imagination you look back to your hometown and your house and your garden and the things with which you were familiar before you left, and they have a renewed interest to you because you think, oh yes, I really want to go back there. Despite all the wonders of this place which I've been attracted to, I can't wait to get back home. So how much more, as it were, on a cosmic scale was this true of the astronauts and planet Earth? And this is planet Earth as seen by a telescope from 4 billion miles away. There are things going off into interstellar space now that can take these pictures and transmit them back to us, and this is called the pale blue dot. And one astronomer described it like this about the pale blue dot: that's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish that pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Our understanding of our responsibility, not just in a physical sense, which is what this is referring to, but perhaps more importantly in a spiritual sense, is emphasized, I think, by taking this view of ourselves from a long way away. So there are many stars, 2,000 to 4,000 visible to the naked eye, but billions exist. We're reminded in Genesis, God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And many expositors have commented on that last bit, said, well, isn't that a little bit of an understatement, given the wonder and the majesty and the number of the stars that are in the heavens? It's almost like an afterthought. He made the stars also. So that was just to give some context. What are the possibilities for life on other planets? Here's some things for us to consider. Firstly, what human life requires. Secondly, the challenges of space travel, either for us to get there or for anyone outside our system to travel to us, if that's what they wish to do. How would we make contact? What mechanism would we use? And then some conclusions. So life, as we know it, needs the following: appropriate elements for bone and tissue, appropriate food in order that we can sustain our existence, appropriately sized planet, so smaller than Earth, like the Moon, is okay, but bigger can make it difficult for a human-sized person because our feet would get too heavy to lift. And even the opposite, going on a small planet. I remember one of the astronauts who was in the space station for 6 months said he'd got to go through special training sessions each day because without the gravity that gives him something to push against and to exercise your muscles and your bones, you tend to wilt away very quickly. So anything other than Earth-sized planet seems to cause either short-term problems or long-term problems to human life for various reasons. We need an appropriate temperature. Planets close to the sun are warmer than those further away, and we need appropriate atmosphere for oxygen and so on, and we need protection from radiation in space and the sun. You might be a little bit concerned when you go on holiday to Australia or some of the places where the sun is known to be a bit stronger than here, and so you take your factor 50 with you. But just imagine what factor you'd need if there was no atmosphere and the sun was beaming down directly. It would be impossible to live at all. And physicists, of which I would say I'm one, have remarked that everything hinges on just three quantities: light, gravity and friction, and they're all constants. They don't change from day to day, and they're very much bound up with the earth on which we live. Or you can put it another way, more scientifically, just 6 numbers, and these represent the fundamental forces which bind together the various ways in which our earth and its systems operate. And Lord Martin Rees is Astronomer Royal, I think, since 1995, and he wrote this book, Just 6 Numbers, the deep forces that shape the universe. And you only need to vary one of these slightly and the whole system no longer synchronizes. So these 6 numbers are critical to the way in which our Earth system and the solar system operates. So they're kind of, although it's complicated, there's a kind of elegance and simplicity about the creation of which we are part when you can reduce it to 6 elemental things like this and understand how it all fits together. So, returning to food and so on, living organisms contain relatively large amounts of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and sulfur. These are known as the bulk elements, along with some other things such as sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium and chlorine. So you can see by the pictures at the at the head of this slide that we're returning to the pharmacist in our beginning of our presentation. Why the pharmacist would be able to give you the answer, is there life on other planets? So there's some key things that are needed in order to support human life, of which your pharmacist would be well aware, and probably have the following slide in their office at the rear of the pharmacy, or at least in their degree course. And here it is. These are the essential elements in the periodic table. Now, I don't want to blind you with science, it's not necessary, but just to note that everything that's in purple here at the lower end of the periodic table are all the things that are essential to human life, and without these existing we would be in serious difficulty, if not existing at all. So the purple, essential for humans, and the green, possibly essential for humans, and all the rest are not essential for humans. This is the typical elemental composition of a 70 gram human, the bulk elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and sulfur, and then some of the minerals on the other side. And planet temperatures, I've got a thermometer here that goes from around about 500 plus degrees centigrade, and this is 0 degrees centigrade, and this is minus 200, minus 250, and a reasonable range of temperature that will support human life unaided is round about here, between 0 and 50, 60, 70, 100 degrees. And we know that Earth is the only planet to occupy this zone where the temperature can be said to be reasonable. The only other one, which is why there's interest in it at the moment, is Mars, which is colder at minus 60 degrees. Could that support life, or has it supported life in the past? The rest are either extremely cold, much colder than an overcoat would give you comfort, or either much hotter, over 400 degrees. So the first thing you need is obviously water, and if the water's boiled away, or if it's all frozen, it's not going to be any good. The other problem is, if we're going to travel there, how to escape from Earth. What is the escape velocity needed to escape from Earth? We've got the gravity, and then we've got the friction of the atmosphere, and it's a large number, 25,000 miles per hour. That's why rockets are very powerful, but also high risk. So if we were on the sun, which would not be possible because we'd be burnt up, but if we were, we would need an escape velocity of 1 million miles per hour, and if we're on the moon, it's only 5,000 miles per hour, because they're bigger and smaller. So that's why when the astronauts returned from the moon, they didn't need a big rocket motor, they just needed some propulsion to get them off the surface and then to join the lunar module, a different scale of operation than leaving Earth. So rocket technology is difficult. Then we've got the problem of getting back, re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere due to friction and heat. It's about 3,000 degrees, and we're travelling about 17,500 miles per hour. And we observed when they went to the moon, it's about 3 days' journey, but it's much longer to travel to Mars at the shortest distance. So well over a year to get to Mars. So you're getting to the scale of things where if you're going to take a journey to another possible planet, you're going to have to make some long plans in order to survive the journey there and back. So what about this journey into space? Well, we've got severe extremes of temperature, as we've noticed. There's no atmosphere, water or oxygen in most places. Temperature on Mars, as I've noted, very cold, and the other planets, as shown on that previous slide, look even more inhospitable. Here's Mars. Some think that the canals on the surface may have had water in the past, or that water may now be underground. The atmosphere is mainly carbon dioxide. Currently it does not appear likely that there is life. But could there be Earth-like planets as part of other solar systems in other galaxies? And that brings you on to a much wider subject, such as multiverses. So if anyone else is out there, how would we contact them, and how would they contact us? Well, one possibility is, and that's what the Search for Extraterrestrial Life is using at the moment, and there's some websites there you can look up if you're interested. This is one example of a radio telescope set up by Sir Bernard Lovell at Jodrell Bank. And when I was working in Wales, I used to come back taking the London to Manchester train, and as you're going along from Wales to Manchester, on the right hand side you could see the radio telescope quite close to the railway line. So it's able to receive radio signals from space on the dish and focus them on the antenna, and then store them and analyse them by computer. You might be wondering, well, why is it out in the middle of the countryside? Well, there's an interesting story about this which Sir Bernard Lovell recounts, which is that when he was working initially at the University of Manchester and interested in these galactic phenomena, he tried to set up his reception equipment in the city centre in the university, and found that because of the electrical spark signals from the trams that were running in the city centre, it completely dominated any signals that might have been there in the reception equipment. So the only solution was to go out into the countryside where there were no sparks from trams running in the city centre. So interesting how scientists are able to adapt and modify their approach. So radio waves like this are able to be received by radio telescopes and by other forms of receiver. So is there life on other planets? Well, from what we've seen so far, it looks difficult, as the living conditions to make the environment similar to Earth are very difficult to find elsewhere in the solar system. However, such living conditions may exist elsewhere in the universe, or in parallel universes, assuming they exist, but they may be a very long way away from us, either in time or space. So the question is, does it really matter? And also, if it's not carbon-based, such as human life, and quite different to what we know and understand. Well, the future for life on Earth is set out in the Bible. Here it is. The earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. So it is a kind of fulfillment of those earlier verses in our presentation from the book of Genesis. God has a purpose with the earth, reveals his creative power and his glory, and he is concerned that men and women shall fulfill their responsibility in terms of the commission that has been granted to them. And Peter in his second epistle looks forward to the time when we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. Now, some expositors wondered, is this literal or metaphoric, or a combination of the two? Doesn't really matter, does it? This is a new order of things where God's glory will be fully revealed as the consummation of his purpose in creation. So our conclusions. The glory and wonder of God's creation, as revealed by the heavens, is set out for us to see. Psalm 8 and Psalm 19 are just two examples. We've noticed that earth is just right for human life. It is truly a wonderful world, and it's difficult to find this replicated, as far as we can see, elsewhere in the observable universe. Earth is well protected by the atmosphere from most flying objects, solar heat and radiation in space, all of which are extremely harmful to us if we were exposed to them. All the other planets in the solar system are inhospitable. And we've also noticed how precious the earth is when viewed from space. But it does leave us with a question: are we doing enough to fulfill the commission of Genesis? In other words, to exercise our sovereignty over that creation and to ensure that that commission is upheld and that it is respected, that it fulfills God's purpose, and that it is not exploited by the selfish will of men and women. That perhaps is something you've not thought about until this presentation, perhaps thought about God's purpose of salvation rather than the purpose of commission to make sure that our relationship to the natural world is what God intended it to be. We've noticed also there's a very complex interrelationship of laws and objects, from the cosmological level down to the microscopic and atomic levels. An example of that was the just 6 numbers. And we've noticed how all these laws work together in harmony. And because they're so integrated and harmonious, we take it for granted. It's only when someone shows us a picture of the Earth when viewed from space, like here, we realise this is the only planet with colour that we can see how beautiful it is. How does it work? Why did God create it in this way? How harmonious it is when men and women do not exploit the natural world for their own ends. We've also seen how small and insignificant we are compared to the vastness of space, and therefore the need to show humility and reverence in the face of the majesty and the glory and the sovereignty of God. Nevertheless, we're not left without hope, because we are insignificant, because the psalmist records, he knows our frame, he remembers that we are dust, and in this we can have hope and confidence. And finally, the visible creation, which you've had a lightning tour this afternoon, is clear evidence of the invisible God. So this is what the universe tells us about God. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse.